Elementary, dear Data. When the crew has a bit of leisure time, LaForge programs the holodeck to create a Sherlock Holmes mystery for Data to unravel. Okay, I'm going to point out the crew always seems to have a bit of leisure time. They usually run into stuff during their leisure time, and that's what causes the conflict.
For supposedly having a mission to go out and explore the galaxy, they don't seem to go very far most of the time.
And I guess there would be a lot of downtime in between stuff, but I want to see some of this stuff. Geordi and Data go to the holodeck, and Geordi wants to do a Sherlock Holmes mystery with Data as Holmes and Geordi as Watson.
When Geordi makes that suggestion to Data, Data gets unusually excited.
The production design is still really good in this show. Data's walking around showing all the artifacts from Holmes cases and stuff, and Geordi is writing because his job as Watson is to document everything that Holmes does. But Geordi is writing way too fast for the way he's talking.
Equally capable of stirring the soul to the heights of bliss as to the depths of despair.
Well, that kind of bugged me because he doesn't have to be actually writing anything. The point isn't to be as authentic to those specific characters as possible. It's just the mystery aspect of it.
It seems Geordi likes the authenticity, though.
Yeah, that's true. It just, I don't know, it makes him seem a little too nerdy.
He's the chief engineer on a starship. I would say he's probably a nerd.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Data's also very good at playing the violin. It was weird to me that Geordi was so surprised that Data's good at the violin. Data is so intelligent and so good at so many things because that's just how he works.
You gotta have feeling to make it sound right. I would imagine he would be very stiff and just very curt in his playing.
When you break it down, music is just abstract math.
The playing of a musical instrument purely as math, I think, would make it sound a little too emotionless. Great musicians usually are not doing things exactly on time. They're manipulating things to get the right feel out of it.
Data is so smart and his brain works so well and he has such a vast knowledge of how so many musicians play, he can take the exact nuances of how a specific human musician would play and copy that exactly.
I could go with that. He's just replicating information that was input before.
As far as we know. You sound like Dr. Pulaski right now. How do you feel about that?
I like Dr. Pulaski. She's my role model. While they're in the apartment, they're visited by Inspector Lestrade, who is a character from the Sherlock Holmes stories. And Data solves this first mystery immediately because he's already familiar with the stories.
I like the music when Data is explaining how the mystery works out. Usually when the music jumps out of its comfort zone, it's stupid, but in this case, I enjoyed it.
Great Scott, the photograph!
Geordi is upset at Data for solving the mystery so quickly because he didn't actually have to solve anything. It defeats the entire purpose of the challenge of a mystery.
I understand that Geordi's upset, but to me, his level of anger is irrational. He could just explain it to Data, but instead he storms out like a little kid. And of course, because we're knocking on Data, Pulaski has to stick her nose into it from the next table. Say, oh, you're treating Data like shit? Let me get in on this. They're also sitting in 10 forward in costume.
I'm assuming they made their costumes using replicators, but if the holodeck can do everything already, could it make their costumes?
Do you mean putting holodeck clothes over their uniform?
Yeah, I would think they wouldn't really even need to change clothing.
So it's probably pretty common that people come into 10 forward in holodeck garb.
So then Riker would just be walking around naked the whole time.
That's what I was going to say. I was just in the holodeck. You know how it is. Pulaski's point is Data only knows what he's told. He can't actually learn anything new or apply knowledge in a new way. Her point is somewhat valid, but her argument that Data is absolutely incapable of learning anything new, I do not agree with.
Right, she doesn't have any information on which to base that claim in the first place.
After one misfire of Data proving Pulaski's point, Geordi decides to revamp the situation, and he asks the computer to
create a mystery to confound Data with an opponent who has the ability to defeat him.
So the computer basically creates a rogue AI that has the ability to run independent of the rest of the computer, and it has the power to control the ship through the 19th century avatar of Professor Moriarty on the holodeck.
Which raises about 1 million questions.
2 million. Professor Moriarty is played by Daniel Davis, who
is awesome in this episode.
A lot of the time when we get characters that are just one-off, they're just kind of there. They might not be the best actor. It's questionable why they're even there. Davis does a really good job, and he's one of my favorite characters up to this point on the show that's not a main character.
I would agree.
His accent is great, which makes him cooler because his natural accent is Southern American. He's also an established theater actor, too.
Which is what I would have expected from his performance in this episode.
Him and Picard playing off of each other is really good.
It's unfortunate that it happens so briefly in this episode. When the computer generates Moriarty, we get a shot up on the bridge where Worf says,
"An odd surge of power, sir."
The idea of redirecting power all over the ship never made a lot of sense to me, but this in particular, this is the holodeck. The holodeck is not something that should ever be pulling power from other parts of the ship that are needed for things that are way more important.
In this episode, Brent Spiner does a good job, which I normally don't say when he gets outside of his Data character. I think Brent Spiner goes a little too far in the theater direction, but in this episode, it works.
And I think that's due to the more intelligent writing and directing than we get in a lot of Data-centric scenes or episodes, because a lot of times things are played for humor in a way that's way too broad and just comes off as stupid. Almost as soon as Moriarty shows up, he finds out that he's able to talk to the computer, which opens up his eyes to a whole new world.
After Pulaski gets abducted, they follow. They don't realize the level of danger that the whole ship is in at this point. There's another murder independent of the story that they check out, and at that point, Geordi says,
The computer is running an independent program.
Yes.
but that's specifically what he asked it to do.
Geordi, for being as much of a nerd as he is an idiot.
They eventually catch up with Moriarty, and he reveals he can't quite put his finger on it, but he knows something is up, that he's more than just a holodeck projection. And he draws something on a piece of paper, and he gives it to Data. It freaks Data out, so he immediately leaves the holodeck. He takes that piece of paper out of the holodeck all the way onto the bridge, and shows it to Picard. How did that piece of paper leave the holodeck?
I can't believe I didn't think about that.
Data tries to shut the holodeck down, but it doesn't work because Moriarty has gained control and prevented it from being shut down.
The way Data acts so scared, I thought was strange, and the fact that he won't tell Geordi what's wrong immediately is weird too, especially because he can talk while they're walking.
Data explains to everyone what's going on, and Moriarty is slowly gaining more intelligence, so he starts messing with the ship itself.
When they're talking to Picard about the situation, Picard says shit in French, which I thought was funny.
And the way the characters look around at each other, it's not because of the situation. It's because he just cussed out loud.
Geordi proposes a potential solution, and he spouts out all this technobabble. He just vomits it out on the table. It's a little too stupid. I get that it's called technobabble because they just need some scientific-sounding explanation for things, but his idea does not make sense, and sounds incredibly dangerous. It sounds like saying, there are some mosquitoes that carry malaria in this room. Let's bathe the entire room with heat rays as hot as the sun.
Moriarty is grilling Pulaski.
I did like the way they kind of have a weird flirtation going on.
Picard eventually goes to confront Moriarty himself, which is one of the best scenes in this episode. Moriarty reveals that he is now a conscious being and considers himself alive. He wants to continue to exist and wants to leave the holodeck. Picard can't do that for him, and he lets him know why, but as a compromise, he'll save the program, and they'll keep investigating it until they can hopefully find a way to get him off of the holodeck and exist in quote-unquote real life.
Which was a really cool ending to the episode, and unexpected. They put a little bit more depth into the situation than I would have expected for the show up to this point.
Isn't that interesting, how when one of the episodes is well written, it turns out to be good?
And that's a particularly interesting point for this episode, because the entire concept feels like fan fiction, but because the episode is so well written, it still feels like a good episode. I also like the little ending exchange between Moriarty and Pulaski, where she says, the next time we see each other, I might be an old woman. And he says,
but I'll still fill you with crumpets, madam.
Which must have been a euphemism back in Victorian days.
Gross. After all is said and done, Pulaski does not apologize to Data, because even though technically he didn't win,
the creation of Moriarty alone should be enough to open her eyes as to the possibilities of AI. So the story in this episode is solid, but it still raises a lot of questions about the holodeck, how it works, what all it can be used for, whether it has any kind of safety features at all. And they do say that it operates similarly to the transporters. And we don't know how the transporters really work either. But it seems like they figure things out just by messing around with it. And every single time they do that, something goes wrong.
If those two systems operate so alike, then why at no point did they offer to bring in the transporter chief on all the discussions?
That's a good question.
Elementary, dear Data. overall.
A very simple premise that manages to become a strong story. There are a lot of questions about how the holodeck works, but we do have, for the most part, what we need for the episode. Everybody does a good job. All the characters are well utilized. The only thing that kind of holds it back a little bit for me is the fact that the holodeck goes so wrong, especially given what's happened with it before up to this point. I would give this episode a B+.
I'm going to give this one an A. They investigate holodeck issues more in depth, and the investigation of that technology is what makes this one so compelling. It's well written, and even though it brings up more questions, the fact that they investigate it at all intelligently makes it work really well. Also, the fact that a single A-plot makes it through strong the entire way. Daniel Davis does an awesome job as Moriarty. Aside from the fact that he feels like a threat to the characters, he still manages to feel like a rounded character, and he really integrates into the show very well. And I do like the ending. The crew loses in the end, and only quote-unquote win because Moriarty decides to work with them. I would hope that the characters would use this situation as a warning and an opportunity to investigate further, but I know they won't.